Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for staying for our Q&A tonight. It gives me great pride to introduce the director of Drive, Mr. Nicolas Refn.
I'm sorry that I said fuck on BBC this morning.
We should just clear the air straight away. I don't know if any of you saw Nicholas's interview this morning with Bill Turnbull, but the F word was used live on air.
But it's kind of difficult when some woman comes up to you and says, "This is a family show, please be very, very polite." You're like inviting trouble when you say that.
It was the first time apparently in 10 years that the F word's been used on the BBC before lunch, and I think that, so, yeah, exactly. And the first time in more than 10 years that someone's discussed existentialism on the BBC before lunch as well, so hats off for that.
Well, I think what shocked her more than anything else was she was very nice people on that show. I don't know them, but they were very nice. And she was going on about how the violin was very shocking and how it suddenly came out of nowhere and how I did that technically. And I said to her, well, violence is like fucking. And she had a heart attack.
Not in my household.
But I was trying to explain that, you use violence the same way you use sexuality. It's all about the build-up. Like, the payoff itself is just mechanics. So the more you're invested in the build-up, the more it's going to pay off.
I think it's an interesting way to start talking about Drive, actually, is the difference between the film's attitudes towards sex and violence, because obviously there's some really graphic violent scenes in it. But much as there's fantastic chemistry between Ryan and Carey, the relationship's actually fairly chaste. They don't really do anything, and even once the husband's out of the way, the most they kind of share physically together is a kiss in the elevator, obviously. Now, why did you approach the two sides of the film in those very different ways?
Well, essentially, I wanted to make a fairy tale, and the Grimm's brothers, I'd been reading Grimm's brothers for my eldest daughter a few years ago, and I remember thinking it would be interesting to make a movie where the love story was so pure that it was all about the idea of love, and then afterwards it would get really violent, because that's usually what happened in the Grimm's fairy tales. And when Drive came about, I had this idea that what if to do a love story in LA, but there was never the complication of love. It was more like the innocence of love and what we'd like love to be. And in order to have that, he would also need to protect it later on, so you could justify the extreme violence.
And Ryan's character is very unusual in that respect compared to a lot of cinematic heroes at the moment. When you were making the film, or even back at the scripting stage, were you aware of writing him in the tradition of any other particular cinematic heroes? I mean, for me, it was reminiscent of Le Samurai, and even possibly Shane as well. I mean, did any of that kind of feel into it?
Absolutely. I mean, he's certainly built on an archetype of a certain hero that you have a lot in America because of the cowboys. We also have it in the samurai movies and so forth, which is the enigmatic man who comes out of nowhere to protect innocence. And because of his past as a mystery, he becomes more dangerous and more, mysterious, and also more romantic and more, iconic, just because his behavior speaks for him. And it's something, when we look at characters, strength we admire, and vulnerability we identify with. Weakness we identify with as an audience, but strength we admire. And the Ryan Gosling, our driver, is a man of pure strength, so we admire his almost like ambiguity, and yet it becomes much more dangerous. And in Salas's book, which is brilliant, I highly recommend it, there's a huge backstory of the driver. But I limited all that because I felt it would be more interesting for a film version that he became more mysterious, and it was more a tradition of a great American hero that basically comes, to save the innocents out of the West with violence.
There are a few changes from the book to the film version as well, of course. I mean, am I right in thinking the Carey Mulligan character is actually not Irene but Irina in the book? Now, was that a change that you made because you particularly wanted to cast Carey in the part, or did that come out for another reason? The book takes place a lot of in Echo Park, which is the American part of Los Angeles, and I'd found the location there, and I was shooting there, but I couldn't find the actress to play Irene.
or Irina, as she was probably pronounced. And I met with all the great talents in Los Angeles of Latino backgrounds, and there's so much of it. And I was very fortunate that everybody was able to do the movie, but I couldn't make a decision. I could not. I couldn't make up my mind, which was odd because it was all in front of me. And we were getting closer and closer to start date, and a lot of people were getting a bit nervous because I wouldn't make a decision. And out of nowhere, I got a call from Carey Mulligan's agent asking if I would meet with her. And I had not seen an education. My mother had seen an education, and my wife had seen an education and said it was very good. So, of course, you take meetings when somebody says, would you please meet with my client? She really much wants to say hello to you. And I said, yeah, sure, she can come by the house if she wants to. And she did. And the minute she walked through the door, and I'd never met her, well, actually, that's true. I met her once in Australia where we didn't really talk. We felt very, very arrogant towards each other. So when she came through the door, I knew exactly that it was going to be her. And I think it's because I fell in love with the innocence that she kind of came with, and it reminded me very much of my own wife. And now I could fully go on the journey of the driver to go to this extreme dark place in order to protect her. So it was kind of weird that suddenly, overnight, it went from something completely different, and then I just went back and I changed a lot of the script. But also that changed the standard character a lot as well. So, and we were already almost shooting at that point, so it kept on evolving through the progress of the film.
Now, in terms of the rest of the casting of the film, speaking as a big fan of Christina Hendricks, did I detect a note of mischief in casting her? Because certainly when she came on screen, I don't know if anyone else in the audience felt the same. It's like, oh, fantastic, it's Christina Hendricks. And then 10 minutes later, she's dead. It's like, oh, what? I mean, was that an intentional thing, or did you always have her in mind for that?
I was originally casting porn stars for that role. See, Hollywood works like this. You have a list. The list consists of the same 5 people that the list last year had on, except if you were in a flop, they cross you out. And so for all the people that I was meeting for Irene that I didn't want right away, they sent in for Blanche. So it's a bit like recycling the same 5 people. And I was like, come on, give me a break. It's not going to work, you know. So, so I said, well, why didn't you try to, you know, let's go into the old X-rated world and see if there's something more interesting. They were like, well, how do we find them? And I said, you're in Hollywood. They're all around you. So that was like a huge thing that they actually had to go and cast these people. And a lot of them actually were quite good. And then I got a call from her agent asking if I would meet with her. And I've never seen Mad Men. I really didn't know anything about her. So I was like, yeah, sure, if she wants to come by. And she came by the house, which was one of the rules. They had to come by my house. And she came by, and she was just so awesome. Like, wow, like, who are you? And she was very nice and fun, and she was very creative, and we very much really designed the character there, so I gave her the part right away. And then I realized how big she was because I had not seen Mad Men, and I thought, well, okay, if she's going to die, I'm going to blow her head off. So it was like, I blew her head off. So
I mean, from the very moment the film starts and you get that electric pink typeface up on the cinema screen, it wears its sort of influences on its sleeve, does Drive, very, very boldly. I mean, did you deliberately make this as a genre film? Did you approach the material in that way? Or was it more an existential film, but with genre inflections?
Well, I make genre movies, but I make genre movies which are about existentialistic characters, because all the characters that I make movies about have some kind of deeper internal search, whether it's Bronson or Valhalla Rising or the Pusher trilogy, that always leads them to some kind of violent climax, which is odd because I'm not a violent man. I mean, I'm a very non-violent man. I mean, I'm a very feminine man. I don't like guy stuff. I don't play sports, and I don't really like men, but I love women, and I always set out to make films about women, and I always end up making them about violent men. And I don't know how I get to that. It just always ends up like that. It's certainly not the intention.
And there is that kind of running theme through your last 3 films, certainly, of male protagonists who violence is kind of their trade, or part of what makes them them. You know, Bronson obviously, One Eye in Valhalla Rising, and then someone who's a stunt driver, you know, is part of this very kind of violent set piece. Is that something that you've consciously sought out to do, or is it just the way things have worked out?
Well, it kind of came while I was making Drive, but there I saw there was a pattern that would repeat itself about transformation. I mean, and all those three films are about a man who transforms himself into something else. And you can say Bronson was about a man who transforms himself into art as a violent act. And Valhalla Rising is about a man who transforms himself into a human being through mankind's evolution, and Drive's about a man who transforms himself into a superhero for all the right reasons. So hopefully I'm done with that part of my life.
Well, look, on that note, let's open the questions to the floor, because I'm sure everyone's got a lot to ask. Now, there are some roving microphones around. I can't quite see where they are. But raise your hand if you've got a question, and then we'll take them. Okay, so there's a mic up there, so let's go to this guy here in the middle.
Hi there. Just want to say, really enjoyed the film.
Thank you.
Did you ever consider filming Ryan Gosling hammering the bullet into the guy's head?
No.
Was that too violent?
No. It's just because it was something we came up with the spur of the moment. Ryan and I are very telekinetic, so we think alike. And I think it was something that we came up with while we were there. He was like, why don't I just like hold it like that and the hammer up? It was like, great, but if we have done it, the act would be dead.
Save it for the DVD.
Yeah.
And I love the totally passive look of the strippers in that scene as well. I mean, whose idea was it? Just because it's such a great, you know, it's probably the most sexual moment in the whole film, I think. But
well, I mean, art consists of two emotions: it's sex and violence.
Come on, it is.
And so the idea was that because as he becomes violent, he transforms himself into his own movie. He becomes like an actor or a character in his own film about a man who saves purity. And so, you know, the sexuality of the violence that is shown generally in Hollywood films is very seductive. So there is a kind of sensibility where sex and violence becomes the same thing, essentially, because the relationship between them is so pure that it never gets complicated. So it's almost like the sexuality actually comes through the violence in the film.
Next question. Where's the microphone gone? Over there. Okay, this down at the front here.
Hi, I was wondering when you started working on the music, because for me it was an additional color to the film, and and the sound effects as well, because it never stops.
What's never stops?
The sound effects and the music.
Right. Well, I don't do drugs anymore, and so music is very much a way for me to enhance my emotions, because essentially I'm a fetish filmmaker. I make films based on what I would like to see. And music helps me with that, to wanting to see certain things, not always understanding why I want to see it. I'll leave that to other people to analyze. But so I always try to define, if I make a movie, if it's a piece of music, what would it be? Because then I would listen to that music when I was developing it or writing and so forth. And you know, like Bronson, it was the Pet Shop Boys, so I would listen to the Pet Shop Boys 24 hours a day, forcing everybody else to listen to the Pet Shop Boys 24 hours a day. And with Valhalla Rising, it was like Einstein's Neunbein, and that was like the sound. And then here, I always wanted electronic music, something that would counterbalance the masculinity of the car, this very American macho world of violence, you know, men of doing violence as a noble act. But I wanted this very feminine sound, and I began to listen to a lot of Kraftwerk when I was the development stages, and even when I was shooting it, and that kind of, when they made their first electronic music, it came out of these very almost antique instruments that had this kind of feminine pop sound to it. And then you kind of evolve into the Eurovision sound that of course ended up being the sound of the movie. And then when I had chosen the pop songs that are in the film, I then had Cliff Martinez emulate the sound of those songs into his score. And then in terms of sound, you know, sound never stops. It just evolves through a movie. But my favorite sound of all is always silence, because it's the one key note that you can turn everything around constantly, because it's unpredictable. And silence is actually when we feel the most. It's also the most bare and sparse approach to anything, because that's when you really touch somebody deep, 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 because a voice, a dialogue is what you hear. It becomes logic, where sound goes straight to the heart, and there's silence is the strongest element.
I think another thing about the music that really struck me on watching the film is the way it's just dovetailed so beautifully at the end by going back to that song with the refrain, a real hero and a real human being. I'm assuming the lyrics of that are totally chosen to be pertinent to.
Well, that was, the way that the songs came about was that Matt Newman, who edits the movie or my movies, is a very part of my creative evolution, and he's more obsessive than I am about certain things. And he, when I said electronic music, he would basically scout the world of electronic possibilities, and he came with all these options, and then I chose the one that I liked. And Real Human Being, Real Hero was a great way to bookend the film and started with, because essentially that was what it was all about. Also, because the driver is half man, half machine. So by day, he's a human being, and by night, he's a hero. And for her, halfway through the movie, she needs a human being in her life, and then she needs a hero. So coincidentally, that there were a lot of people that wanted me to change the music. There were certain people involved in this project that wanted Canon West, or other more, what they would call audience-friendly radio listening music, which showed they didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. But I really strongly felt that this would best represent the film, and I'm very happy that the way, because it reminded a little bit of my John Hughes period when I was in my teens in the 80s. John Hughes will always choose very interesting music, and he would play the songs all the way through at the end.
Next question. This chap down on the front here.
The film was scaled down from $60 million, is that right? As a franchise picture?
Well, originally Universal had bought the book called Drive, and I think had a heart attack, because it was essentially a 100-page existentialistic novel about a stunt driver in Los Angeles. And then they spent X amount of percentage of it developing it into a kind of a $60 million Hugh Jackman, Fast and the Furious kind of spin-off. And that was a long time ago. That never got made, so the script had just been lying around in some kind of Universal vault, and nobody had been interested. And then Ryan had read it and kind of liked some of the kind of concept of the cars and a man in a car. But then, ended up changing a whole lot, because I had a different kind of fetish that I was more interested. And then I read the novel, which is brilliant, and I said, I want to make the movie about a stunt man. That's what it is. And Hossein Amini, who had been adapting the script for many years, is a wonderful writer and became a great collaborator with me in Los Angeles, where we basically just tore the script apart and put it back into its place, but with a different sensibility. And all the studios passed on it. So it went way, 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 way down in budget. And so it was basically back to shooting a European movie in LA for 7 weeks.
How did the screenwriter feel about that? Retooling it from the ground up when you'd been working on it for years, and then you come along and smash it apart.
I don't care.
But this is something that you did with Bronson as well, right? Because I remember when you got the script for Bronson in the first place, it was a completely different film, and then you just rebuilt it.
Well, it's because I can only make the kind of films I make. I'm not the best filmmaker in the world. There's a lot of much better filmmakers than me. But I can make my kind of films. But Hossein Amini is a wonderful writer who's about to be a director also. And I think for him there was also kind of fresh perspective on it, because it basically been studionized till death.
Okay, next question. Yeah, just down at the very front here.
One of the things I really liked about the film, which is great by the way, you should be really proud,
Thank you.
is the fact that you cast a lot of actors that were basically playing against type. For example, you got Carey Mulligan as a young mother, Albert Brooks as a rough gangster, and Ryan Gosling as a literally bloody psycho. So was this always the intention, or did you have other people in mind, or how did it come about?
No, I mean, Albert Brooks was essentially goes back to the list because, again, you're giving the list of the 5 people that played bad guys, heavies, and I can't read out the names because it's too embarrassing to read it out, but it basically consists of the same 5 people the year before. But I was like, I really felt Albert Brooks would be an interesting choice also because I had changed the character in the original material and also the book, who is more of a mobster. Then I wanted him to be a film producer that used to be a gangster, and through the course of the film had to go back to be a gangster. And I wanted Albert Brooks, not that I really knew Albert or had never really seen a lot of his movies. I did remember seeing Lost in America when I was very young in New York, and I always was kind of fascinated by him. He was like the psychotic version of Woody Allen. And so in order for it to work out, I wanted to meet him, of course, first before we could finalize anything, because I spoke on the phone with him first, and it was really interesting. And then he came to my house, of course, and he's pretty neurotic and very interesting and very intelligent, very smart. And actually, just from our first conversation, I came up with this fetish knife idea, that he was fetish about knives, and that's how he kills people. And through the course of our conversation, I realized this man was a volcano of emotions, that essentially he would kill somebody in real life, so let's do it in a movie kind of thing. So I gave him the part right away. And it was great, because then having him not played a gangster before was really surprising, because none of us really knew how it was going to work out. And it was such a pleasant surprise. And he's, again, I'm very collaborative in the sense that I let a lot of times the actors, even write their own dialogue if they want to or something, because I shoot in chronological order, so it becomes very a communal kind of creative effort of saying, well, let's try this, let's try that. And of course the actors were very much into that. So Albert is a very smart man. You could really use that, in terms of his character and how to build him up.
Is that where his monologue about being a film producer came from?
Yeah, and that came from the whole thing where I used to make movies, sexy stuff.
Next question. Yeah, just 2 seats down. Perfect.
Hi, yeah, I thought all of the bits of the film interlocked so perfectly. The music was absolutely perfect, and I thought the visuals were great. And I just wanted to ask, where'd you get that jacket from? Because it's amazing. It's definitely a fetish thing. The number of shots where you've got Ryan from behind and seeing the jacket, I was like, yeah.
Well, the jacket came about from Kiss, I Was Made for Loving You. And I had this idea of a satin jacket after hearing that song about 1,000 times, because it kind of reminded me of an era where I was still fairly too young to understand like anything. But that fusion of rock and disco and the glam feel and the way that a satin jacket in white would illuminate him at night was kind of interesting to me. And when you then have great actors like Ryan, an actor really, wardrobe is very important to them because that's how they build up their character, a lot of the DNA. So Ryan would then go out and find the type of jacket that he would feel comfortable in and as a character, as an actor. And we chose the one that really, fitted everything really well. And it had a lot of these animal symbols, American iconic, like an eagle or shit tiger, something like that, and snake or whatever. And I was like, oh, that's great. You should have like an animal on it. And then we had the jacket custom made in satin, of course, to have that whole 80s. I don't remember those 80s jackets. That was a satin feel. And then one day, while it was being made, Ryan and I and the costume designer were out in the mechanic shops because Ryan was building his own car to understand the surgery of a motor. And we were just looking around, seeing how to shoot a garage scene, actually, me and the costume designer, and a woman called Erin. And I showed her the trailer for Scorpio Rising, which basically consists of men working on their cars, and in a very fetishistic way. And it starts with a scorpion. And because Ryan and I are telekinetic, we were able to right away say to each other mentally that it was going to be the scorpion. Well, actually, we're anticipating a Stanford experiment on telekinetic people, by the way. But it became the symbol because this is who he was, essentially. And later on, Ryan came up with the idea that maybe he could use the story then as a metaphor to describe his full transformation, which was a great idea. And so that jacket really came out of Kiss. And there's only like 5 versions of it around the world.
What I love about the costume design in this film is it's not just shot fetishistically, but it's also mic'd fetishistically, like when you've got Ryan clenching his fist in the car, you get that fantastic creak of the leather around his knuckles.
Well, leather is very seductive. You know, I don't know anybody's into leather here, but it's a very seductive
Have you
sound.
seen my collar?
Right. And you can enhance things like that. My wife would never let me. But things like that become also, because when you strip away dialogue, sound becomes so crucial just to tell the story, and also the body movement of the actors is so crucial. And I'm sure in the beginning Ryan was a little bit confused why I kept on wanting shooting his back with the scorpion, but it was also a way because his performance is so powerful that just from the back and the combination of the jacket and the symbol and his aura, which is quite unique, it was such a powerful image. You know.
Next question. Yep, just up there in the middle.
Yeah, hi there. I've been a bit surprised in the discussion of the film not to hear the name Walter Hill mentioned a little bit more as an influence. I was just wondering if you've seen The Driver and if you're a fan of his work generally.
Well, I love Walter Hill, and I'd never seen The Driver because Driver was always very hard to get on VHS and DVD, and it wasn't really right before I started shooting that we were able to track down a copy of the DVD, and then I saw it, and it's a terrific film. But I say we're more like Melville and the Sergio Leone films were much more like an inspiration because they were genre movies made by Europeans with American icons essentially in it, in terms of their characters. But I know that I believe that Jim Salas had seen The Driver that inspired him to write the book. So there's an indirect reference, of course, to Walter Hill's superb movie.
Next question. Over at the side there, yeah.
Hi. You've mentioned on occasion working with Ryan whilst you were directing the film, and I was wondering how, when working with actors, can it create like a healthy or unhealthy relationship, and where do you draw the line with how much influence you can take from actors when basically shooting your film?
Well, it kind of depends on the relationship with them. I mean, this whole film came about in a very strange way because I was in Los Angeles doing a movie called The Dying of the Light with Harrison Ford, where he plays an ex-CIA agent who goes like on an existentialistic journey and dies. It was a beautiful script by Paul Schrader, and I was so happy that I got to kill Harrison Ford. And it was great. LA, killing Harrison Ford, the money was there, we were gonna go make it. Then Harrison decides not to die. So it's a bit like, fucking hell. And I was really annoyed and distressed, and I got a call from Ryan out of nowhere. We'd never met, and asking, he knew I was in LA, and if there's a way for us maybe to get together and talk about doing something. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? That's why I'm here, you know. And I would only be in LA for very short stretches of time because my second daughter was born. So even though I was ill, actually, in those couple of days when I was in LA, I'd got the flu coming on the plane. I said, yeah, we can have dinner tomorrow night. The problem is I was really, really sick. And when guys are sick, they get very weak. And because we can't give birth, we're so weak. And Harrison had got me these anti-flu drugs that took the flu down, but it also made me high as a kite. So I was literally stoned out of my mind when I went to have the dinner with Ryan. And I stumbled into the restaurant about a half an hour late and sat down at the table and became the chair. I couldn't really have a conversation with him because I was so out of it, and I couldn't look at him because I would be sitting here and he would be sitting where you are, and I couldn't turn and look at him, so I'd be like this, it'd be like that, and he'd be very trying to have a professional conversation, and I was just not able to say anything, really. About an hour and a half into that dinner, I asked him, would you please take me home? It was a bit like a blind date gone wrong. And Ryan was just, yeah, sure, okay. You don't drive? No, I don't drive. I failed 8 times. So, and I was basically too cheap to get a cab, because it was going to cost me $40. because this was not going to lead to anything. You know, essentially, this was not a very productive meeting, and I was so out of it anyway and pissed off that Harrison wouldn't die. So anyway, we get out of the restaurant and we get into the car, and up until then, while we're having dinner, we had talked about music and a little bit about movies and so forth. And as he's driving back to Santa Monica, that awkward silence, you know, that awkward blind date silence where you're like, no action, let's just get out of the fucking car. It's unbearable, so Ryan turns on the radio and it's soft rock. And it's very seductive. And R.E. Speedwagon's I Can't Fight This Feeling Anymore starts to play. And I'm a child of the 80s again, you know, so that, wow. You know, and then when you're ill and you're stoned out of your mind,
I can't wait to hear how this story ends up. This is it's kind of fairly steamy.
Well, because what was interesting, it kind of defined us in the end, but I was so out of my mind, and then I started singing Sorry Speedwagons, I Can't Fight This Feeling Anymore. Really loud, obnoxiously loud in the car. And then I started to cry. And I really had tears rolling down my cheeks. And, you know, I was missing my wife and my kids, and Harrison wouldn't die, and it was just all fucked up. And why was I here? And it was kind of like an emotional relief for me. I was building myself up to this. But it gave me an idea for a movie. And I turned to Ryan and I said, very loudly, I screamed at his face actually, because I really hadn't looked at him the whole time. And he was just petrified. Here I was crying and singing in his car. I said, I know we're gonna make a movie about a man who drives around at night listening to pop music, because that becomes his emotional relief. And that cemented our relationship so strongly. It was almost like a non-sexual encounter between us that led to a connection that we had. So when we started making the film, there was no boundaries of what one could do or not do. It was a true kind of collaboration. And my point is that as a director, if you can connect with your actors on such a strong level, it's a wonderful way to collaborate just all the way through, because essentially the director is there to help the actor express their emotions, because that's what the audience buys at the end. That's what we live for. That's what we react to. And a director is not an expert on something particular, but he has to know everything about everything else. And you have then experts to help you tell the story, because the director is the author of the movie. He is the creator of the film. You know, filmmaking is a director's medium, or most films are. And that way, the more you can connect with your actors and of course test and play and rehearse everything through, the more truthful it gets to it. But essentially, it is your movie. You are the director, and they're there to serve your needs. But the more you can collaborate on that journey so they become one with you, it's much more beneficial.
I think there's a really eerie parallel as well between the way that, obviously you've got Ryan Gosling in this film, and there's a sense that his career is just about to explode, with the way that you cast Tom Hardy in Bronson 2 years ago, and what's happened to his career since then. I mean, what's this knack that you've got for putting a finger on someone and saying, they're going to be big, and this is the film that's going to make them big?
Well, I guess to begin with, I have to thank Jason Statham, because he turned down Bronson. He was my original choice, and he goes, "Nah, mate, can't do it."
I thought you meant the English Jason Statham.
Yeah. Funny.
Well, thanks for coming.
I was trying to do my Ewan McGregor accent. John got the job, and I've just been very lucky. I mean, it's luck. It's just pure and simple, right place at the right time, and it's super cool.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Who else? Yep, up at the back there.
Hi, you mentioned your desire to kill Harrison Ford, and also your choice to blow Christina Hendricks' head off. The death that I thought was most affecting was probably Nino's, because of the relative peacefulness of it. And I just wondered if there was anything you could elaborate on in terms of that choice.
Well, I don't know how to.
I think with that death, there's someone help me out here. I think with that death, there's a sense that Ryan's character is taking on the mantle of the hero because he's got that the head cast of the hero from the film that he's acting in, and he sort of takes that on and then goes to sort of settle the score that way. The head cast was incredibly realistic. Was that one? I mean, how did that kind of come about? Was that something that you had?
No, Ryan sent me a link to a place you can buy these masks for like a couple $100, because there was a story that broke out while we were preparing the movie about a man who's basically had a mask of another nationality on while he was robbing banks. So they were looking for wrong nationality, so he was able to get away with it because of this mask. It looks very realistic and quite creepy.
Right. There was another question just up at the back. Yeah, just over on the side there.
Hi. I was impressed by the level of intensity of emotion between Carey and Ryan's characters through scarcity of dialogue and looks. And I was wondering if you could sort of describe how sort of those scenes developed, because I think you said this morning on breakfast that a lot of that was done sort of in the process of the making of the movie.
Well, I shoot my films in chronologically order, and a lot of it had to do with how the actors build up their characters, and also it's a way for me to change the moves as it goes along, and not really knowing how the ending is going to be. The way that we did those scenes, because the Americans are so nervous, that we wrote a little bit of dialogue, Haas and I, and then I took it out when we shot it. But the whole idea was to tell a love story without them ever saying a single word. And that meant that I would just shoot them again and again and again and again and again. And then before each take, I would go over and I would start by hugging Ryan, and I would hold him until he gave in to the hug, which in the beginning took a little longer because I think that was a bit odd. And then I told him that go with God. And then when it came to Carey, it was the same process again of hugging her until she kind of just gave in. And then I said to her, "Let's fuck." And then I would take it again and again and again. So sometimes I wouldn't even yell cut, I would just continue with them. And that way it was a way to develop a language very early on how to do those scenes. So the further we got into it, the easier it was for the actors to basically strip away all their technical acting in terms of dialogue and movement, and it was just basically how they would perceive each other. And it was very interesting, and it, I would cry every time that it would work. So that was kind of, and I would be listening to music at the same time, and tears were rolling down my cheeks. It's very embarrassing sitting an American macho crew, and you're like, but it was a way to cement, their relationship.
Okay, time for one last question. Yeah, right up at the back there.
The chase scenes were very effective, so how much research did you put into directing those scenes, and how fascinated are you by the stunt drive world?
Well, I mean, the stunt drive, when you have 7 weeks to do the whole movie, including stunts, you're really under the gun in terms of, because driving scenes are really hard to do because they're so technical and there's so much safety and there's so much maneuvering. They're very boring to shoot. They're fun to edit, but they're very boring to shoot. So I came up with this idea that each car chase, rather than, because I didn't have the money or the time to do what some of the other movies do that are so extraordinary in terms of how the car moves and what they can do and the length of things, that each car chase would more represent his emotional state. So the first car chase was the idea to make a car scene where we never leave the car. We only see the chase from the car's point of view. It's like a diver in the ocean with sharks. You never acknowledge the sharks. You only experience from his perspective. And the second car chase, it was more about this, the emotional turmoil that he was caught in after Standard gets shot, and the sound of the machines, the violent behavior of an engine and the sound of it. And then the third one was more like, what would it feel like if you were to kill somebody with a car, and the kind of determination that the driver has transformed himself into. Also because he has changed his costume into this pure kind of, larger-than-life superhero.
I think there's no question as well that that way of shooting is really helped these scenes, really improved them. I mean, when you see car chases in like the Fast and the Furious series now, because there's so much CGI at play, there's no real weight or mechanics behind what's happening. But and especially in that scene after Standard gets shot, there's a real sense that these are huge, metal things that can do a lot of damage.
Well, they were, and having been in so many car crashes, I have a car phobia. So I find them very scary, but also something sexually exhilarating about it.
Scary and sexually exhilarating. Let's leave it on that note. Nicolas Winding Refn, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.